guys, welcome back. We are on chapter 16, or A Girl Like Jane. Okay, the moon was brighter than any torch. I walked for what felt like hours, ignoring the cold in my freezing feet. Where could he have gone? The falling snow had obliterated his trail. It was small comfort that he had taken the rifle. As the night tripped on, I began to lose hope, and by the time the pale dawn light was kissing the horizon, I was frantic. I called Jehu's name, shouting it to the very trees as if they might be kind enough to let me know which direction he took. My footsteps left a clear trail, so I knew I would be able to find my way back to the cave. Jehu, I called, Jehu. Sometimes it seemed as if I heard a voice answer, echoing back to me on the cold, chill air. In the end, it was not my cries that found Jehu, but my foot. I tripped right over him. He was buried in a thick drift of snow, and only his hat was visible. I crawled next to him, digging him out as quickly as I could. Jane, he croaked hoarsely, his face pale. Are you hurt? My leg. There was a long, ragged gash cut through the pant. I felt my way along the leg as Papa had taught me, but I could find no break. Still, it was swelling fast, and he would quite likely have difficulty walking. I tore a length of fabric from my skirt and proceeded to wrap the leg. I was getting mighty tired of dried venison, thought a little roasted rabbit might be tasty, so I set off after this rabbit, and then the ground just gave way beneath me and I went tumbling. Crawl back up here, he said, leaning his head against my chest, his eyes fluttering shut. No, Jehu, I said, waking him. You can't fall asleep. His eyes opened a slit. Can you stand? I demanded. He opened his mouth to speak, and then his eyes went wide in warning. I snatched the rifle from his frozen fingers, whirling around to protect him with my very life. A familiar, large, lumpy figure stood outlined by the rising sun. Harry Bill, I exclaimed with, I confess, delight. Ma'am, he said, tipping his furry hat. Guess you were right about him following us, Jehu joked tiredly, his eyes shutting again. Hurry, I urged Harry Bill. We must get him back to the cave. Supporting him between us, we managed to half carry, half drag Jehu back to the cave. One leg tied with a bloody rag, his face pale and drawn. Caruxo saw us trudging up the pass and ran down to us. He grasped Jehu's hand. Brought some rabbit for breakfast, Jehu whispered. Rabbit? Jehu smiled weakly and pointed to his sack. Caruxo slapped Jehu's back in admiration. I made Jehu comfortable and then prepared roast rabbit for breakfast. Jehu had warmed up by this point, was feeling better with some food in his belly, animatedly described his adventures. After we had finished our breakfast, Caruxo and Harry Bill headed out to survey the vicinity to see if the snow was melting enough for us to continue our journey. Jehu, his eyes flush from the fire, his thick black curls plastered to his forehead, his scar winking up at me, fell asleep where he was standing against the cave wall. I took off my cape and tucked it high under his chin and breathed again. In the late afternoon, the sun burst out from behind its gray shield. The snow rapidly turned into wet, heavy slush. The swelling had gone down in Jehu's leg, but I thought it better that he'd not walk on it, at least for this day. Harry Bill and Caruxo rigged a litter that they dragged along. As we made our way down the mountain, the slush gave way to deep, squishy mud that caught at my boots and tugged at my skirts, and then it began to rain. In addition to being muddy and smelling of skunk, my skirt was soon soaked, and my petticoats chafed my skin until it was raw. Only Harry Bill seemed to keep dry in his amazing cape. He walked for an eternity, and finally the rain tapered off. But every step in my thick, wet petticoats made my legs feel like lead. Soon the men in the litter were far ahead of me. They rounded a bend, and when I went round it, they were nowhere in sight. Had they left me behind? Despairing, I sat down on a fallen log. I was in the middle of the wilderness with nothing but wild animals and foul weather, and I had been abandoned. I was going to die here, and nobody would ever find me because they'd have to dig through so much mud to get to the girl, Jane. I looked up, swallowing hard. Jehu and Caruxo and Harry Bill were all crowded around me. Are you okay? Jehu asked, a strange expression on his face. No, I wailed. I'm soaking wet. My skirts are muddy. I smell like a skunk, and I'm going to die here in the wilderness. Your hair looks real curly, though, he said with a gentle smile, fingering a thick, wet strand. Take off skirt, Caruxo said. Take off my skirt? Are you mad? He pointed to the thick layers of petticoats. Too heavy, he patted his own pack. Wear Boston pants. Wear a man's pants? But I'm a lady, I said hoarsely. You're too pretty for anyone to mistake you for a man, Jehu said. Crooksow's eyes seemed to agree with Jehu, and I bit my lip. I suppose no one would see us in the wilderness. See me, I amended. My gaze slipped to Harry Bill, who was looking at me expectantly. I'm not going to change in front of you, I said. Don't mind me, gal, Harry Bill leered. You, I ordered Harry Bill, go as far away as possible, and you two, I pointed at Jehu and Crooksow. Watch him to make sure he doesn't get lost and wander back. Well, I never, Harry Bill muttered. I'm a married man. 15 years ago. Crooksow dug out the pans and handed them to me, and I went behind a bush. I peeled the soaking wet skirts off me. My legs were raw from where the wet fabric had chafed at them. I quickly slipped into the pants. They were huge but blessedly dry. At least they matched my boys' boots, although I hardly thought that the young ladies back in Philadelphia would be rushing out to purchase the ensemble. Quite fetching, Jehu said when I emerged. Oh, please, I huffed, clutching the huge waist. They're a bit big. He pulled a piece of rope out of his bag and looped it around my waist, his fingers moving fast, expertly nodding. Jehu winked at me. This'll keep him up. I certainly hope so, I muttered. The world is not ready to see Jane Peck in her unmentionables. Jehu chuckled. I began to fold up my skirt. It was sodden and stinking. It was a sodden, stinking bundle. You're not carrying that with you, Jehu asked askance. Even Crooksow groaned. Hey. Whoa. Watch out, self. Of course I am. After I wash it, it shall be as good as new. I am not about to show up at this get-together dressed like a man. Do you want to say hi? What will the governor think? Who cares what he thinks? That skirt stinks to high heaven. I'll carry it. I don't mind the smell, I said, shoving the mess into my pack. That's because the rest of you smells just like it, he muttered. I was exhausted, every muscle aching, when we finally stopped for the night. I rather doubted we'd even walked a mile because of the mud and slush. We camped at the bottom of the mountain, not far from a river that roared and crashed in the distance like an angry child. I collapsed on a blanket of somewhat dry pine needles, tugging off my boots. My feet were throbbing. I didn't know that feet could hurt so much, I groaned. You haven't spent enough time on 'em, Harry Bill said with a grunt. When are we going to get there? I begged Crooksow. I feared that between the lost canoe, the snowstorm, and Jehu's injured leg, we were making very poor progress. What if we're too late? What if Mr. Black gets there first? Jehu's head snapped up. You're worried about Black getting Russell? I folded my hands and looked down. I've had some time to think, and I believe that perhaps Mr. Black might have ill intentions toward Mr. Russell, I said in a careful voice. I'm gone for one day, and look what happens, Jehu shook his head and whistled low. What brought this change of heart on? Nothing, I said stiffly. I just had time to think. He eyed me closely. Come on, Jane. I stared at him. Well, I saw his back, I mumbled. You saw his back? You mean his bare back? I nodded shortly. He folded his arms, his lips set in a line. Well, well, well. That's right, she saw Mr. Black's back, how it had all of the bear scratches. I flushed hotly. It's not what you think. I can think a lot of things. It was foggy. Anyway, he was taking a bath, and I saw his back. He raised an eyebrow. He was taking a bath, I continued. Something you could stand to do yourself? At least I don't smell like skunk. Oof. I wish you had frozen to death. Then maybe I could finish a sentence properly. It's all about properly with you. What's so proper about watching a man take a bath? That's something you learned at that fancy school of yours? He drawled. I was fetching water, and he was at the stream, and I saw his bare back, Jehu supplied helpfully, and it was covered with terrible, terrible scars, I finished on a screech. Jehu was silent for a moment. He and Crooksow exchanged a meaningful look. Crooksow pressed his lips together and nodded. Probably not Memaloose, he said thoughtfully. After a restless night haunted by dreams of Mr. Black's inscrutable face, I awoke early, tired and wrung out. The air was curiously still. It had rained again sometime during the night, but now the sun was peeking its pink head over the trees like a curious kitten. A man's snoring rumbled in my ear. Crooksow was sprawled out, fast asleep and arm's length away from me, but both Harry Bill and Jehu were gone. Had Mr. Black set upon us during the night? Had he kidnapped Jehu and Harry Bill at gunpoint while we slept? Was he picking us off one by one, just as he'd done with the rest of the silencers? A snatch of song whispered through the morning air, elusive as the wind. Mr. Black. I took a deep breath and set out carefully, creeping low. The song became louder as I got closer to the river. I peered through the bushes and could hardly believe my eyes. Jehu was kneeling by the river, my skirt in hand, scrubbing it against the rocks as he hummed a sea tune. He was washing my skirt. For a moment, all I could do was watch him as he scrubbed my filthy skirt in the river. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. He stood ankle deep in the water, his black hair gleaming in the sunlight like a crow's wing. He slapped and banged and rinsed my skirt again and again, holding it up to smell it every few minutes, pulling back with a grimace each time. My heart swelled so full with love, I thought it might burst, and then it nearly stopped beating. For ambling lazily up along the riverbank was a grizzly bear, headed right for Jehu. It was clear to see that I was going to have to rescue him again. I bolted out of my hiding place, shouting loudly to get the bear's attention. "Oh, hello, pardon me," I shouted to the bear. The bear paused and looked at me as if curious, and then its head went down and it started to lope on again. I grabbed up a rock the size of my palm and threw it with all my might at the bear. "Jane, no!" I heard Jehu shout. The rock bounced off the bear's head, and it turned on me with a roar. "Run, Jane!" I ran up along the river, the bear growling behind me. I dearly hoped Jehu had the rifle with him, for by the roaring of the bear it was plain to me that an apology, however well-intentioned, would not suffice. Ahead of me, the riverbank narrowed to a cliff. "Hang on, Jane!" Jehu hollered, limping as fast as he could on his injured leg. I paused on the edge of the cliff, looking back. I could see Jehu in the distance, scrambling up after the bear, but he was still quite far. The bear, however, was steps away from me. It shook its head and roared at me, advancing at a terrible pace, its teeth sharp and snarling. I looked at Jehu and back at the bear, and then did the only thing one could do in such unfortunate circumstances. I jumped, of course. While I had not given the present situation much study, I was well aware of my history of bad luck when it came to cliffs and rivers. I had fallen off a cliff during the summer and had nearly drowned trying to rescue a canoe from a river. It seemed to me that the most sensible way to avoid such predicaments was to steer clear of cliffs and rivers. I considered all of this as I went tumbling through the air, the landscape a blur, the colors bright around me, the sound of Jehu shouting a soft note in the background. When I hit the icy water, the breath left my body. My head bobbed up, and I opened my mouth and sucked in great gulps of air as the current swept me away. I was traveling fast down the river, and I was freezing cold, but I felt amazingly calm. Perhaps I was getting used to putting my life in danger. Still, it seemed very silly to think of drowning on such a beautiful day. The sun was shining and the sky was bright blue, that always came after a storm, and come to think of it, it wasn't really all that terrible a way to die. Drowning certainly seemed a kinder way to end one's days than being eaten by a grizzly bear. "Jane!" Jehu was shouting at me from the riverbank, and the next thing I knew, he had dived into the river, and I felt a strong arm against my waist tugging me toward shore. He shoved me up on the bank, and I lay there breathing hard. Jehu grabbed me by my upper arms, pulling me to my feet and shaking me. "What were you thinking?" he demanded furiously. I said, grasping for breath, holding him tight. "You were the most foolish girl I've ever met in my entire life." "I saved your life," I shouted, "and I'm tired of being bossed around by a bunch of men. I'm wet and muddy, and I stink, and I'm sick of everything." "Oh, Jane," he said, his face softening, "you may be muddy and you may be wet, and you may smell like a skunk, but you're still the bravest girl I've ever known." I held my breath. He gently moved a wet hunk of hair off my nose and looked into my eyes. "There's never been a girl quite like you, Jane." All I could do was stare at him, stunned. What did a young lady say to such a pronouncement? What would Miss Hepplewhite recommend in such a situation? Or Mrs. Frink, for that matter? Truly, what should I do when confronted with a sailor whose eyes had haunted my dreams for so long that I saw them in the blue of the sky after a hard rain? Except maybe kiss him? And that's just what I did. Afterward, Jehu denied that he had ever been in any danger. "I saved your life. That bear was definitely going to kill you, just like the grizzly that got Mr. Black," I said as we walked along the trail, his hand warmly clasping mine. "You didn't see the look in its eyes." "That bear," Jehu said, tweaking my nose affectionately, "was minding its own business until you threw that rock at him." He paused importantly, slinging my wet skirt over his shoulder with a slap. "And for the record, I saved you from drowning." "You did not. I was doing perfectly fine on my own." "Perfectly fine drowning, I'd say," Jehu guffawed. "I saved your life." I looked at his dear face, his laughing eyes, his scarred cheek, his dancing grin, and knew that we were both right. In the end, we had saved each other. Aww. What a sweet chapter. All right, there's only 2 more chapters left, and I will see you next time. Thanks for joining.